Okay, good evening, folks. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Um, my name is Samantha Salvedo. I am the manager of the Center for Access and Accommodations at College of DuPage. Tonight, I am going to be talking specifically about transitioning from high school to college for students with disabilities. Please feel free to put any questions you may have along the way in the chat as you think of them. As soon as I finish with my main presentation, I will circle back and answer any questions that are in the chat. Or if you want to ask them verbally, once the first part of the presentation is over, I'd be happy to take questions then as well. One of the first things I like to start out with is noting some of the differences that all students should be prepared for when transitioning from high school to college, not just for students with disabilities. Although we do see that with some of these particular changes, certain categories of groups or groups of individuals with disabilities do tend to have a slightly more difficult time with them. But even when I had my own transition from high school to college, I remember some of these things just being very different and something that took some getting used to and definitely some practice. So when we look at the high school setting, we see a lot of teacher contact, and it's really easy for students to get that contact with their instructors. Right before class, after class, in between classes, during a study hall or a lunch period, they have really easy access to their instructors. At the college level, and particularly at College of DuPage, we have wonderful faculty who are really very, very willing to meet with their students outside of class, provide one-on-one support. But scheduling is really the key to making sure that that happens. So many of our instructors teach classes back to back. Once we start transitioning to more classes back on campus, we're going to see some teachers who are going to be teaching a virtual class right backed up to a face-to-face class. And so trying to catch a teacher on the fly is really a difficult thing to do. And it's not the best way to make sure that the student has their undivided attention, especially if it's something important and related to their disability or their accommodations. So students really need to understand and get ready for the fact that if they need to communicate with their teacher about something a little bit more personal or that has to do with extra support that they need, starting out with that email to them is going to be the best step to make that happen. So a simple email just stating, "Hello, professor, I'm having some difficulty with X, Y, and Z. Can we schedule a time so that we can meet outside of class?" In high school, we see students have a very strong automatic support system. So particularly students with disabilities have this IEP team that kind of comes around them with support. People are assigned to certain tasks and certain duties to make sure that the student stays on track. And a lot of that is put into place without the student having to coordinate much of that. When students get to the college level, they are really responsible for building their own support system. So they are not required to be affiliated with my office to have accommodations. We hope that if they are a student who has a disability and accommodations help them to be more successful, that they will certainly choose to have us as part of their resources. But they're not required to. They're not required to meet with counseling and advising, although, again, in order to make sure that they're on the correct pathway, not wasting any of their time or money, having somebody from that department is very, very important. Financial aid, veteran services, if appropriate. There's a variety of resources at the college, and the student really has to be the one who's in the driver's seat to reach out to those departments and let them know, here's what I need, and I want the help from your office. How can we make that happen? In high school, we see a lot of structured time. Students are told what to do, where to go, when to go from one place to another. Things are very scheduled without a lot of input from the student. And they're sitting in class face-to-face or virtually face-to-face with an instructor for about 25 to 30 hours per week. When students get to the college level, they have a lot more freedom to make choices about what they want to do with their time, including whether or not they want to attend class. Again, we don't advise skipping class, but ultimately the teacher isn't going to hunt the student down. They're not going to get somebody calling from the college saying, why weren't you in class today? They are going to face natural consequences if they don't go to class, but ultimately that decision is theirs. Students who attend college full-time will be enrolled in about 12 to 15 hours, credit hours, which equates to that same amount of hours per week that they're actually sitting face-to-face with instructors. So that's significantly less time than most students are used to at the high school level, and it can be very deceiving. We have a lot of students in their first semester, first year of college who think that they are doing great and they're on track because they're showing up to all their classes and they're participating in their classes, but they're not doing much outside of class. And students really tend to underestimate how much time outside of class they need to spend reading their textbook, researching outside of their textbook, working on projects that are often, longer in duration and are comprised of multiple steps that they have to pace themselves to completing. So students really need to start as soon as possible practicing that time management. Time management is a skill that is hugely important, not only in the college setting, but once they get out into potentially a job setting as well. So the sooner that anyone supporting a student with a disability can start working on that with them, the better. Okay, so this heading often gets people, especially parents. They get really nervous when they see this. So let me explain it in more detail to make sure that everyone kind of understands what exactly this means. So IEPs, 504 plans do not go to college. So we, again, get a lot of first-time students who think that we are automatically going to get their IEP or their 504 plan because they sent their transcripts to the college. That doesn't happen. Disability health information is not something that comes to the college with a student's transcripts or grades from high school. So it's really important to understand that there's a completely separate process for our office, a completely separate process that students need to take in order to make sure that they give our office the information that we need to support them. So students who have IEPs and 504 plans in high school shouldn't necessarily assume that everything that was in their IEP is going to be what they're eligible for once they get to college. And the reason for that is because the laws that apply to students with disabilities at the high school level are very different from those that protect students with disabilities at the college level. So again, in looking at the list of accommodations that are in an IEP, it's not going to be a direct transfer over to the student's college accommodation plan. There may be some similarities. There may be some accommodations that the student had in high school and they're going to have those in college, but it's not a direct transfer. So let's take a look at those laws that I just mentioned. At the high school level, students are protected at the high school, K through 12 actually. Students are protected by IDEA, which is an entitlement law that the whole goal and purpose is to make sure that students with disabilities have a supports in place, accommodations in place to make sure that they successfully move from class to class, year to year, and that ultimately they graduate from high school and move on to the next phase in their life. At the college level, students are protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which those two laws are civil rights laws. So the focus is on reasonable accommodations, making sure that courses are accessible to students, and making sure that students with disabilities are not discriminated against on the basis of having a disability. So again, the goal of the accommodations is not to guarantee that a student is going to be successful. It's not to guarantee that the student is going to get A's, B's, or C's in all of their classes. It's really meant to make sure that students have that equal access to an education as their peers who do not have disabilities. Students must be otherwise qualified to enroll in their classes. So we can't waive prerequisite criteria. We can't say you're exempt from having to show that you are qualified to take this course. That's something that, regardless of their disability, they need to be able to reach a placement test score or prove competency in other ways that the college dictates. Okay, another law that I want to bring attention to is FERPA, which is a privacy act that protects students at the college. So at the college level, as a law, employees can only discuss a student's educational information with the student themselves. So this is another big change from that K through 12 setting in which parents are heavily involved and can be heavily involved without the student even knowing perhaps that a conversation has taken place. At the college level, even if a student hasn't turned 18 yet, they are considered to be an adult and they are protected by FERPA. And one of the things that's really important to remember, because we get a lot of parents who are upset because they feel like they can't advocate for their son or daughter. But fundamentally, this goes back to protecting your son or daughter's rights. So we can't always assume that the person calling is a friend or a true advocate to that student. We've had situations where parents have called and that parent and that student have been estranged for years. And they're trying to get private information about that student. So we can't assume that everybody is calling has the best interest in mind. So it really comes back to protecting that student and making sure that the people who are involved in their education are the people who they dictate they want to be involved in their education. So there is a FERPA waiver form that a student can sign through the Office of Student Records. And they can designate an individual who they want to have slightly more access to their information than some random person off of the street. But it's not an all access pass. So it's not a waiver for somebody to call up and say, did Susie attend class today? That's not how it works. It allows for some limited information sharing, oftentimes more related to actual educational documents, a transcript, things of that nature. And ultimately, it allows the college to have some limited communication with whoever that designated individual is. It doesn't require them to. So there's many faculty who, if they get an email from mom or dad, if they get a phone call from mom or dad, they're not going to return that phone call. They're going to go back to the student and say, your mom or dad called me, what's going on? And in our office, the way we operate is that if a parent, guardian, supports person contacts us and we see that there is in fact a FERPA waiver on file, we are still going to go back to that student first and say, this person contacted us on your behalf. Do you want to set up a meeting with the three of us? We will never do something that completely excludes the student from the conversation, with the exception of if it's medically related, if the student has had some type of medical emergency and they're not capable of being part of that conversation at that point in time, that's a completely different circumstance. But in general, on a regular basis, we're always going to go to the student first and ask them if they want to include that person in any conversation that they want to have with our office. Okay, so a really, really brief and overview of the K through 12 system that definitely does not highlight how wonderful I know the staff who work with students with disabilities at the K through 12 level are. But just for the purpose of highlighting some of the differences in responsibility. So for students with disabilities at the K through 12 level, so much of the responsibility falls on the school or the district in terms of identification of disabilities, financially providing testing for the student. So a lot is legally on the shoulders of that school or that district. If a disability has already been identified or through the process of testing a student, a disability or specific learning need is identified, an IEP or 504 plan is created, accommodations are identified, and again, the goal of that plan, the goal of that IEP team is to create a plan that is going to help that student progress from year to year and then ultimately graduate from high school. In many situations, everything that's in the IEP is going to apply pretty much across the board to all of the students' classes. And at the K through 12 level, curriculum can be very heavily modified or components of it can be waived entirely. So the expectation of the student with a disability may be very, very different than that of their peers who do not have a disability and who do not have an IEP or a 504 plan. So again, it's fundamentally coming back to that goal of progressing the student forward, making sure that they can graduate. When we get to the college level, much more responsibility falls on the student. So when a student comes to our office to register with us, they must already have a disability diagnosis. We do not diagnose. We do not provide first-time documentation for a student. So that's something that they need to come already having with them. And they must be able to submit that documentation to our office for review to qualify them for accommodations. Determining accommodations is an ongoing process. So it's not something that we just look at once, decide on a plan, and put a stamp on it for the rest of the time that they are a student at College of DuPage. It's something that at least on a semester basis, we are reviewing and determining what's appropriate, what stays the same, what changes, etc. Number 3 is really important, and we'll come back to it in a little bit more detail in just a minute. But many aspects of the curriculum cannot be modified or waived. So again, we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a minute. And the goal of the accommodation plan is to make sure that the student has access to their classes. If there are disability-related barriers, that we reduce or remove them to the best of our ability without altering the course or the course expectations. And ultimately, accommodations are determined based on a variety of factors, including the documentation, an intake interview with the student, and then by taking a look at each of the classes that the student is enrolled in and determining what is appropriate for each of those classes. So let's circle back to that modification of the curriculum. So despite their disability, students must be able to complete the essential course components, meet course objectives, and demonstrate competency of material, or in some of our more hands-on classes that are skill-based, mastery of the skills that are being taught in the class. And the reason for this is because our classes, the essential components, the course objectives, are based on statewide standards, and in some cases, national standards. So when a student passes a particular class and it goes on their transcript saying that they've passed that class, it's essentially telling other schools in the state or in the country that they have met a level of competency in that subject area that they could move on to potentially the next level of that course at their institution without having to repeat that same class there. So we are essentially attesting to the fact that the student has a certain type of knowledge and a certain level of knowledge to say that we have passed them in that course. So there are many things that can't be modified or waived because it would essentially mean that that student hasn't met those components and hasn't been able to demonstrate that competency or mastery. So let's take a look at an actual example. Sometimes that's hard to kind of grasp what exactly that means just talking about it theoretically. And so I always like to give this example because I feel like it helps people understand a little bit better. So if we were to take a Speech 1100 class, which is a communications class, and English 1101, which is a writing composition course. Let's say, for example, we had a student who has severe anxiety, who has a panic disorder. And so the accommodation they request from us is to be exempt from having to do any type of presentation in front of an audience. We would look at both courses to determine what the course expectations are, what those essential components are, what those course objectives are, and what ultimately a student is expected to master or demonstrate by taking this class. So for the English 1101 course, by looking at the course objectives, what it's measuring, we could reasonably say that a student does not need to give a presentation in front of an audience to be able to demonstrate that they have those English composition skills. So if the instructor of that course had decided to utilize a presentation as part of their course standards for that semester, our office could put in place an accommodation to say that the student should be permitted to demonstrate whatever the teacher is trying to measure from that assignment in an alternative way. For the Speech 1100 class, part of the essential components of that course, the course objectives, are that a student is able to present to a group of their peers. So there is not a different way that a student would be able to meet that objective, demonstrate that competency without presenting to a group of their peers. So in this example, for the English 1101 class, we would approve that accommodation, that it's reasonable, that it's appropriate. For the Speech 1100 course, we would say that it is not a reasonable accommodation and we would not approve it for that class. So that's what I mean when I say that we get really specific in terms of how we determine what is a reasonable accommodation and why we have to look at each semester and each class on a very individualized basis. There's certainly going to be some accommodations that are pretty much across the board that students are going to see approved for all of their courses each and every semester. So oftentimes, extended time on tests is going to be something that's pretty universal. Students who utilize digital textbooks, something that we typically approve across the board. There's not really a situation that I can think of where it would interfere with the course or the course objectives for a student to have that as an accommodation. So there's some things that are going to be pretty consistent, pretty routine. We'll approve them. The student will have them for that, each semester that they're enrolled. But then there are some accommodations that during a particular semester, it might apply to some classes and it might not apply to other classes. All right, so because accommodations are determined on that semester by semester and course by course basis, we don't want students to try to come to our office too soon because we need to know what classes they're taking, right? So a student should complete the entire enrollment process up through registering for their classes before they meet with our office. So the only time that sometimes a student can have an intake appointment with our office before they've enrolled is if they're holding on or before they register is if they're holding off on actually clicking the registration button because some students, for financial aid reasons or funding sources, have to delay physically clicking that register button. But they come to us with their educational plan from the academic advisor they met with. And so we know what classes they're going to enroll in. And then if for some reason when it comes time to register, something changes, we would just edit that accommodation plan to reflect that. But students, when they meet with our office, should have already met with an academic advisor and created an educational plan. Again, it goes back to not being able to even determine what is a reasonable accommodation unless we know what classes the student is going to be taking. Students can definitely submit their request and their documentation a little bit further in advance, but when we reach out to get that intake appointment scheduled, the first thing we're going to ask is, have you met with an advisor? Do you have your educational plan? And if the student has not, we are going to not schedule that intake appointment until we know that that has happened. Again, so that we can make sure that we get that plan created for them. All right, so let's take a look at our request for services process. So I'm going to stop sharing that screen for a minute, head over to a web browser. Okay, so you can go to any web browser on a computer, type in cod.edu/access. That will take you to the Center for Access and Accommodations page on the COD website. Scroll down just a little bit until you get to this green box that says Request Accommodations. When you hover over Complete Form to request accommodations, it's going to turn a pretty bright green. And then we get to the intake page. So students will fill out their basic information, identifying information. Scroll down. This student ID number is very important. It needs to be the student's College of DuPage ID number. So when a student fills out the application for admissions, within a couple days, they will get a COD student ID number in their email. So that's going to be a really important thing to make sure you have on hand when you come to fill this out. They will put in their College of DuPage email address, which is an @dupage.edu address. And then scroll down to starting term. The student will want to put which term they're going to be enrolling in. So we do prioritize, especially this time of year, we want to get our summer students, their intake appointments scheduled before our fall students, so that we can make sure that students enrolled in summer have their accommodations and their accommodation plan in place before their June classes start. So if you're a student who's thinking about taking summer classes, putting summer in this field will make sure that we know we need to get you in a little bit sooner. And then the student will select their disability diagnosis. This question here about COVID-19. So throughout the process of this pandemic, we have coordinated accommodations for students who become ill with COVID-19. So it's not for the purpose of tracking students who have had COVID-19. If a student is requesting accommodations because of an IEP, they click no to this. That's really only for students who are specifically registering with us because of COVID-related accommodations. Okay, and then these two questions are something that I always recommend students fill out with a support person. So a case manager, a parent, somebody who knows their academic history, because it can be sometimes hard for students to describe the answers to these questions themselves. So we really encourage students to put some thought into this, not just put look at my IEP, because we're already going to have that. And what we're really looking at in this situation is kind of for the student to reflect on what they've struggled with in school, what they've done well with in school, how their disability has impacted doing good or bad, so that we can get an idea of their own knowledge of what their strengths and weaknesses are, and what they've struggled with or done well with historically. And then what accommodation or accommodations they're requesting. So again, this is an important one to not just copy and paste off of the IEP. We have so many students who will put things in here because it was in their IEP, and when we go to talk to them about it, they're like, oh, I didn't even know I had that, or nope, I never used that. So this is another one of those opportunities for students to really reflect on what they've been eligible for in the past, and then really think about what types of things they think are going to be beneficial to them in the college setting. And then finally, students will upload their supporting documentation. So in most cases, or in a large percentage of cases, students are going to be uploading their IEP or their 504 plan. For students who are uploading an IEP, we prefer the most recent 3-year eval. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the last one you had your senior year, because oftentimes that's not going to be the 3-year eval. That 3-year eval is what's going to have the most comprehensive overview of testing the student has had done, benchmarks, things like that. So that's the one that's the most helpful for us. So parents, students, make sure you connect with your high school case manager and get a digital copy of that 3-year eval so that you have to attach it to this form. In addition to that, if the student has been working with doctors, psychiatrists, therapists, social workers outside of the school setting, that's helpful information and documentation for us to have as well. The more we have a complete picture of the student and their treatment history, the more we are going to be able to make an appropriate determination of if an accommodation is reasonable or not. So the more information you can give us on the front end, the better. So don't hesitate that you're giving us too much. The more the better. All right. Students will submit, and that will send the request to our office. Pretty immediately, a student should get kind of like an automated response to their dupage.edu email address stating that we've received their submission, and they'll hear from us within a designated amount of time. If the student does not get that confirmation email, it means it probably did not go through. So you'll want to try it again. If for some reason it's an email glitch and it did go through, it will tell the student that they can't submit again because they've already submitted. All right. Okay. So once the student hits that submit button, it sends that request to our office, and our office will review the submission and reach out to the student to schedule an intake appointment. For anybody who's here who is an employee of a high school or who has been familiar with COD for a while, or maybe had an older brother or sister who went to COD, our office, the Center for Access and Accommodations, used to use a blue card system. So it's kind of a term that a lot of high schools use. Don't forget to get your COD blue card or things like that. That's a system that we're not using anymore. So the letter of accommodation system is what has replaced that. And so that's what that submission I just showed you starts that process. And then when we schedule the student's intake appointment, we have that intake interview. We review all of the information they've submitted, talk about potential accommodations, and then we approve the student for those accommodations. Students will receive a digital letter of accommodation and it will be sent to their college email address. It will then be the student's responsibility to forward that letter to each of their instructors at the start of the term. And then each semester that the student enrolls in courses, there is a semester renewal process that they will have to go through to have their accommodations approved for their new set of semester classes. They won't have to resubmit documentation to us. We should already have the documentation that we need on file. If there's a brand new accommodation that the student is requesting, we may need to ask for different or more documentation. But if the student is just renewing accommodations they've already had before, we don't have to go through that entire process I just showed you a second time. It's a much simpler process for the student to do electronically. And that's something that we send out reminders to students prior to the start of each new semester with detailed instructions for how they should do that.